The gun was pressed against Marcus Ramsey's temple before Alice Aldridge even had time to scream. She stood frozen in the doorway of the Crescent Moon Saloon, her heart hammering so violently she could feel it in her fingertips, in the backs of her knees, in every terrified corner of her body. The lamplight inside threw jagged shadows across the faces of four men, and at the center of them all was Marcus, hands raised, jaw set, eyes burning with a controlled fury that somehow made the whole scene more terrifying, not less. He was not begging. He was not flinching. He was staring directly at the man holding the gun with the kind of calm that belonged to someone who had already accepted the worst. "You brought her here," snarled the man with the gun, and Alice recognized the voice before she could fully process his face. Raymond Colt, her late husband's business partner, the man who had written her a letter 6 months ago telling her that everything was fine, that the land was safe, that she should come west and collect what was rightfully hers. "You brought this woman into business that was never hers to touch. She has every legal right," Marcus said, his voice dangerously quiet, "and you know it. Legal." Raymond laughed, and the sound was hollow and ugly. "There's no law out here that a bullet can't renegotiate." Alice took one step forward, and three sets of eyes snapped to her. She raised her chin. She had not traveled 1,400 miles from Philadelphia to watch herself become a hostage. "If you pull that trigger," she said, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded, "you will have a dead man and a living witness, and I will walk to the nearest telegraph office myself." Raymond's eyes narrowed. The gun did not move. "Walk away, Miss Aldridge," Raymond said softly. "Walk away and forget you ever had a deed to the Aldridge property. Forget your name. Forget this town. I will make it worth your while." "I already tried walking away," Alice said. "It didn't suit me." What happened next would take her weeks to fully understand. Because it unfolded so fast, Marcus dropped his raised hand sideways and drove his elbow into the ribs of the man beside Raymond. The crack of contact loud enough to swallow the startled shout. And in the half-second of confusion that rippled through the room, Alice grabbed the brass candle holder from the shelf beside the door and hurled it at the lamp on the far wall. The room plunged into fractured darkness, orange and wild, and by the time someone got a second lamp lit, Marcus was across the room with her, the door was at their backs, and Raymond Colt was swearing promises at their retreating shadows. They ran. She had never run like that before, not in Philadelphia, not in her careful, proper life, and something strange and electric surged through her as the cold desert air hit her face and Marcus Ramsey's hand closed around hers, and they moved together into the dark Nevada night as though they had been doing it for years. But they had not. They had known each other for exactly 43 days. And it had begun, as most impossible things do, with a letter. 6 months before that night in the Crescent Moon Saloon, Alice Aldridge was sitting in the narrow front parlor of her aunt's home in Philadelphia, reading a telegram she had already read 11 times. The telegram was from the office of a land attorney in Carson City, Nevada, a man named Horace Webb, informing her that her husband, Gerald Aldridge, had died of a fever 3 weeks prior, and that as his legal spouse and sole heir, she was the owner of the Aldridge land grant, 460 acres in the high desert of the Nevada Territory, along with whatever stood on it. She and Gerald had not been a love match. She understood that now with a clarity that felt almost peaceful. They had married when she was 22 and he was 31, 2 years before he had gone west to try his luck in the silver trade. He had written regularly at first, and then less regularly, and then almost not at all. She had built a quiet life in Philadelphia. She taught piano lessons 3 days a week. She read voraciously. She attended church on Sundays with her Aunt Helena, and she told herself that this was enough. Most women had less, but the telegram changed things. She was 26 years old and she owned land, real land, and she had nothing else. Her aunt thought she was being reckless. 3 of her friends thought she was being dramatic. The attorney she consulted in Philadelphia thought she was being foolish. Alice listened to all of them carefully and then packed 2 trunks, arranged for the piano lessons to be taken over by Mrs. Patterson on Maple Street, kissed her aunt goodbye, and boarded a train west. She changed trains twice and then took a stagecoach for the final leg, a punishing, bone-rattling ride through country that grew more enormous and alien the further she went. She had never seen land like this, land that seemed to have no ceiling, that stretched out in all directions without apology, bleached and vast, and terrifyingly beautiful. She pressed her face to the small, dirty window of the stagecoach and felt something shift inside her that she could not name. Carson City was not what she had imagined. It was louder, dustier, and more alive than she had expected, and it smelled of horses and wood smoke, and something sharp and mineral that she later learned was the water from the eastern mines. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late September of 1878, stepping down from the stagecoach into a street that was busy with men in wide-brimmed hats and women in calico, with horses tied in front of establishments whose painted signs promised whiskey, hardware, or salvation in approximately equal measure. Horace Webb's office was on the second floor of a building on Carson Street. She climbed the stairs with her bag in hand, knocked, and was admitted by a flustered young clerk who looked at her as though women from Philadelphia did not often climb those particular stairs. Horace Webb himself was a small, neat man with silver hair and a deeply troubled expression that he was trying very hard to disguise as professional composure. He shook her hand, offered her coffee, and then told her, slowly and carefully, that things were complicated. The Aldridge land was disputed. Raymond Colt, Gerald's business partner, was claiming that Gerald had made an oral agreement with him in the final months of his life, an agreement to transfer the property in exchange for payment of certain debts. He had no documentation, but he had lawyers and he had money and he had, according to Horace Webb, a considerable amount of influence in the county. The legal situation was messy. It would take time to sort out. In the meantime, Alice needed somewhere to stay and someone she could trust. Horace Webb had suggested Marcus Ramsey. "He is a rancher," Horace said carefully, in the tone of a man choosing his words the way you might choose footing on an icy river. "His property adjoins yours to the north. He knew your husband not well but enough. He is an honest man, Miss Aldridge. In this particular situation that is rarer than silver." "Why would he help me?" Alice asked. "Because Raymond Colt has been trying to buy Marcus's land for 2 years, Horace said. "He has declined every offer. He does not want Raymond Colt as a neighbor on 2 sides. Your presence, your legal claim, it complicates Colt's ambitions considerably." "So he helps me because it serves his interests," Alice said. "Yes," Horace said. "But also, I believe, because he is the kind of man who cannot watch something unjust happen when he has the means to prevent it." She met Marcus Ramsey the following morning. She had expected someone older. She had expected someone weather-worn and taciturn in the way that she associated with frontier men from novels, grizzled, spare of word, radiating competence and silence. She had not expected a man who looked to be perhaps 30, perhaps a year or 2 more, with dark eyes that took her in with a quiet, unsettling intelligence, and a face that was strong-boned and serious and arresting in a way that she immediately told herself was irrelevant. He stood in Horace Webb's office with his hat in his hands, and he looked at her the way she imagined he looked at problems on his ranch, directly, without sentiment, searching for the practical truth of the situation. "Miss Aldridge," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "Mr. Ramsey," she said, "I understand you may be willing to help me." "I'm willing to give you a fair account of the situation," he said. "Whether that constitutes help depends on what you decide to do with it." She found that honest, and unexpectedly she found it reassuring. They sat across from each other in Horace Webb's small office, and Marcus told her what he knew about the land, about Raymond Colt, about Gerald Aldridge's final months, and about the way things worked or failed to work in that particular corner of the Nevada Territory. He spoke plainly and without decoration. When she asked questions, he answered them without condescension, which she had not taken for granted. When she asked him directly whether he believed Raymond Colt's claim had any legal merit, he said flatly no. "Then why is it complicated?" she said. "Because Raymond Colt has money and patience," Marcus said. "And he believes that most problems, given enough time and enough pressure, will resolve in his favor." "He hasn't met me," Alice said. Something moved across Marcus Ramsey's face, then brief, contained, almost gone before she could identify it. But it might, she thought later, have been the beginning of a smile. He offered her the use of his ranch house while the legal matter was sorted. He would sleep in the bunkhouse with his hired hands, he said, which was not unusual during cattle season anyway. The offer was practical, and he delivered it practically. And she accepted it practically. And that was how Alice Aldridge came to live on the northern edge of the Nevada high desert under the uneasy protection of a man she did not yet know, with a land dispute that was more dangerous than Horace Webb had let on, and a grief for a marriage that had never been what she had hoped, still quietly unresolved in the back of her chest. The Ramsey ranch sat in a long, shallow valley between two ridges of pale rock, and it was, Alice thought when she first saw it, genuinely beautiful. Not beautiful in the groomed, deliberate way of Philadelphia gardens, but beautiful in the way of things that have grown honest and necessary. The low white house with its wide porch, the dark wood of the barn and outbuildings, the horses moving in the corral with the fluid ease of animals that are well treated and know it. Everything about the place spoke of care, of someone paying attention. Marcus showed her to the main bedroom, and then excused himself with the brisk efficiency of a man who had already decided on appropriate conduct and intended to hold to it. She unpacked her 2 trunks in the lamplight, listening to the sounds of the Nevada night, the wind in the sagebrush, the distant sound of water, a horse shifting in the corral, and told herself that she was not afraid. She was not afraid. She was something stranger and more unsettling than afraid. She was interested. The first week passed in careful, cordial distance. Marcus was present at meals, his ranch cook, a weathered man named Peters who spoke mostly in grunts and flavored everything with chili powder, produced food that was simple and surprisingly good. And they talked about the legal situation, about the property, about the evidence she might gather to support her claim. In the evenings, Marcus sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and read or looked out at the dark land, and sometimes Alice sat in the rocking chair at the other end of the porch and read too, and they shared the silence without discomfort, which she found she was not expecting and could not quite account for. She had asked him, on the 3rd day, why he had really agreed to help her. He was silent for a moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Your husband used to come over here sometimes in the evenings. We'd have coffee. He was not a dishonest man. He was a tired one, tired and a little lost. He talked about you sometimes." She had not been expecting that. What did he say? That he'd married a woman who deserved better than what he'd managed to give her. Marcus paused. "He asked me once if I thought it was too late to start over. I told him it was never too late. That was about 3 months before he got sick." Alice held the information very carefully, the way you hold something fragile when you're not sure whether it will break you or not. "Thank you," she said after a moment, "for telling me that." "It seemed like something you should know," he said. On the 8th day, Raymond Colt's men rode onto the Ramsey property and told Alice she had 48 hours to leave the territory. Marcus was in the north pasture when it happened. Alice was on the porch with a cup of tea and a legal document she was trying to understand, and 3 men rode up on large horses and delivered the message with the cheerful menace of people who are very sure of their power. One of them leaned down from his saddle and said that Raymond Colt was a generous man, and she could walk away with $500 in her pocket and her dignity intact. "Tell Mr. Colt," Alice said, in a voice so level it surprised even herself, "that I will be remaining exactly where I am." The men left. She finished her tea. Her hands were shaking, but she did not put the cup down until she was done. When Marcus came back and she told him what had happened, He was very still for a moment in the way she was beginning to recognize as his particular form of anger, not explosive, not loud, but pressurized and dangerous and very focused. "They won't do anything while the legal proceedings are active," he said. "Colt is calculating. He wants this to look legitimate." "And when the legal proceedings are done," she asked. "Then we need to have already won them," he said. We landed quietly, and neither of them remarked on it. Over the next 2 weeks, they began to work together with a focus that required them to spend most of each day in the same room, poring over documents, corresponding with Horace Webb, and occasionally riding out to the Aldridge property itself, which sat on the far side of a shallow creek 2 miles south and was currently occupied by 2 of Raymond Colt's men who were maintaining it, they claimed, as a courtesy. The Aldridge property was rougher than Marcus's ranch. It had been let to run slightly wild in Gerald's long illness, the fences needing work, the small house in need of repairs, but the land itself was good. Alice stood on the slight rise at the center of it one afternoon in early October, the wind pulling at her hair and the immense Nevada sky arching over everything, and felt something she could only describe as recognition. As though this difficult, sun-baked, beautiful country had been waiting for her without knowing it, and she had been coming toward it without knowing it, and now here they were. "You love it," Marcus said. He had come to stand beside her, not close, but close enough that she was aware of him in the particular, heightened way she had been trying not to think about. "I don't know it well enough yet to love it," she said, "but I think I'm going to." He nodded, as though she had said something that confirmed a conclusion he had already reached. She asked him about his own history on the 11th day of her stay, when they had finished an evening of document review and Peters had cleared the table, and there was nothing left to productively focus on. She asked where he was from, and he said Missouri, originally. She asked how he had come to Nevada, and he said simply that he had needed to go somewhere that wasn't Missouri. She waited and he talked slowly, in the careful way of a man who does not often talk about himself, about a younger brother who had died in a farming accident, about a father who had drunk himself into an early grave afterward, about the years of drifting work that had followed, ranch hand and trail driver, and a brief, unhappy stint working security for a silver company that turned out to have ethics that Marcus found intolerable, and then about the land. "I saw this valley," he said, "and I thought if I could get this land, if I could make something here that was mine and honest, then all the time before it would be worth something." He paused. "It took me 4 years and everything I had. But I got it. And now Raymond Colt wants it," she said. "He wants everything," Marcus said without particular heat. "Some men are like that. The having isn't the point, it's the wanting and the getting." "What do you want?" she asked, and then felt heat rise in her face because the question had come out differently than she'd intended, or perhaps exactly as she'd intended, which was worse. Marcus looked at her across the table. The lamplight was between them, warm and flickering. His dark eyes held hers for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. "Something worth having," he said quietly, "when the time is right." She excused herself shortly afterward and went to the bedroom and lay on the bed in the dark for a long time, listening to the Nevada wind, thinking about a man who wanted something worth having, and a woman who was only just beginning to understand what that might mean. The breakthrough in the legal case came, unexpectedly, from a woman named Dolores Vega. Dolores ran a small laundry operation near the edge of Carson City, and she had, it turned out, worked for Raymond Colt's household for 3 years before a dispute over unpaid wages had ended that arrangement with considerable bitterness on both sides. She had heard through the tightly connected web of the Spanish-speaking community in the area that the Aldridge widow was fighting Raymond Colt in court, and she had come to Horace Webb's office one Thursday morning with a leather-bound notebook that had belonged to Raymond Colt's late bookkeeper, a meticulous man named Ernest Farrow, who had documented every financial transaction he had ever witnessed. apparently out of a deep personal commitment to accuracy that had survived even his employer's frequent instructions to be less thorough. In that notebook were the details of every payment Raymond Colt had ever made to Gerald Aldridge. There was no payment corresponding to the alleged land transfer. Not a cent. Not even a mention of the alleged oral agreement. There was, however, a note in Farrow's precise handwriting that said, on the date Raymond Colt claimed the agreement had been reached, Gerald Aldridge had been documented as being confined to his sickbed with a fever high enough that the attending doctor had not expected him to survive the week. A man who could not stand could not have shaken hands on a deal. Alice read the notebook in Horace Webb's office and felt something release in her chest that had been held so tight for so long she had forgotten it was there. Beside her, Marcus read it too, and when he looked up there was a brightness in his expression that he normally kept very carefully contained. "This is it," she said. "This is close to it," he said, which was his version of jubilation. They celebrated that evening at the Crescent Moon Saloon, which turned out to be a mistake of considerable proportions. Dolores Vega joined them for a meal, and so did Horace Webb. And for an hour it felt like something approaching triumph, food and coffee, and the particular giddiness that comes with having found the lever that will move an immovable thing. Marcus, who was characteristically measured in his expressions, allowed himself 2 glasses of whiskey and once, without appearing to be fully aware that he was doing it, put his hand over Alice's where it lay on the table. She did not move her hand. He did not move his hand. Neither of them acknowledged it, and both of them were acutely aware of it for the remainder of the meal. Raymond Colt's men found them there. And that was how Alice Aldridge came to be standing in the doorway of the Crescent Moon Saloon, watching a gun pressed to Marcus Ramsey's head, understanding in a single crystalline moment that she had very little to lose and quite a lot to protect. After they ran, after the cold night air and his hand in hers and the wild, breathless flight down the back street behind the saloon, they stopped behind the livery stable and stood in the dark, breathing hard. She could feel his pulse in the hand that was still holding hers, or possibly that was her own pulse. She was not entirely sure. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. "Are you?" He shook his head. He was looking at her with an expression she could not fully read in the dark, but it was intent and close, and something in it made her breath catch for reasons that had nothing to do with the running. "That was either very brave or very reckless," he said. "Both, probably," she said. "The candle holder was all I had." He looked at her for another moment, and then, quietly, he laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded and warm, and she had not heard it before. She had seen the beginning of a smile. She had heard dry humor deployed with precision, but she had not heard this. It transformed his face completely, and she found herself laughing too, the way you laugh after terror with your whole body, the relief of it enormous and slightly hysterical. "We need to get to the county sheriff," he said when they had recovered themselves. "Tonight, while the evidence is still fresh." "Raymond Colt has influence with the county sheriff," she said. "He has influence with Deputy Morrison," Marcus said. "He does not have influence with Sheriff Aldine. They are not friends." They went to Sheriff Aldine that night. He was a large, deliberate man with a gray mustache and the deeply skeptical expression of someone who had heard a great many stories in his professional life and believed approximately 15% of them. He listened to their account without interruption, asked 4 precise questions, and then sent 2 deputies to the Crescent Moon Saloon to collect Raymond Colt and his associates for questioning regarding a charge of criminal threatening. Raymond Colt was not at the saloon. He had already left town. But he had left in a hurry, and men who leave in a hurry make mistakes. He had left behind, in the room he had been renting above the saloon, a satchel that contained, among other things, his personal correspondence for the past 6 months, including a letter from his own lawyer in San Francisco that described, in careful legal language, the strategy of intimidating Gerald Aldridge's widow into abandoning her claim, and characterized this strategy as having been employed successfully with several other property owners in the preceding years. Sheriff Aldine read the letter twice. He looked up at Alice with something that might have been respect. "Miss Aldridge," he said, "I think you may have just unraveled something considerably larger than a land dispute. It took 3 more weeks, and the involvement of a federal land office agent named Chester Payne, who arrived from Sacramento and brought with him the weary efficiency of a man who had seen this particular kind of fraud in 7 other counties and knew exactly how to dismantle it. But in the end, Raymond Colt's house of cards fell comprehensively. The legal claim to the Aldridge property was dismissed. 3 other property disputes that Colt had manipulated were reopened. Raymond Colt himself was located in Reno, arrested, and transported to the county seat to face charges that included fraud, criminal intimidation, and what Chester Payne described, with considerable understatement, as an ambitious pattern of misappropriation. Alice Aldridge became, on a cold November morning in 1878, the legal and undisputed owner of 460 acres in the Nevada high desert. She stood on that slight rise at the center of her land, and tried to understand what she felt. The sky was enormous and the sage was silver gray, and somewhere below her, the creek caught the thin winter light and threw it back in pieces. Marcus stood beside her. He had been beside her for most of the past 6 weeks, and his presence had become something she relied on with a completeness that she had not allowed herself to examine too directly, because examining it would require her to know what to do about it, and she had not been ready. She thought she might be getting ready. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. "Build something," she said. "Something real. I'm going to fix the house. Get some livestock. Maybe plant a kitchen garden in the spring." She paused. "I have no idea how to do any of those things." "You'll learn," he said. "You learned everything else." "I had help," she said. A pause. The wind moved between them. "You'll still have help," he said, "if you want it." She turned to look at him. He was looking straight ahead at the land at the distance with the careful stillness of a man who has said something important and is waiting to see what comes back to him across the space he just made himself vulnerable in. "Marcus," she said. He turned then and looked at her. There it was, what she had been watching gather in him for weeks, contained and private and now finally present in his face without the usual careful management. He wanted her. Not the land, not the legal victory, not the practical alliance. Her. "I know the timing isn't straightforward," he said. "And I know you've had a year that would give anyone reason to be careful. I'm not going to pretend that I don't." He stopped, started again. "You are the most remarkable woman I have ever met, and I don't mean because of the candle holder, though I will not soon forget it." She laughed, and the laugh turned into something warmer, and she stepped forward and took his hand, the way he had taken hers in the dark street behind the saloon, deliberate and certain. "I think," she said, "that you should know that I have been in a fair number of arguments with myself about you for the past 6 weeks. "Who won?" he asked. "The side of me that is standing here holding your hand," she said. He looked down at their joined hands, and then up at her, and the smile that came then was not the beginning of one, not the restrained almost smile she had been cataloging. It was complete and unguarded, and it did something to her chest that she suspected would prove permanent. He did not kiss her then, which she would later tease him about. He was, she would come to understand, a man who took things seriously and did not rush what mattered. He said, "I'd like to take you to supper. Properly." "Not at the Crescent Moon Saloon. Anywhere but there," she agreed. They walked back toward his ranch in the late November light, still holding hands, and she thought about the 6 months that had brought her to this. The telegram, the train, the stagecoach, the enormous desert, the legal documents and the narrow victories and the terrifying night and the cold desert air. And she thought, not for the first time but now with considerably less ambivalence, that she would not have traded a moment of it. The supper was at a small restaurant called Hattie's on the main street of Carson City, and it was conducted with all the careful ceremony of 2 people who have been pretending not to be in love, and are now adjusting to the fact that the pretense is over. They talked for 3 hours, About everything about Missouri and Philadelphia, about music. She played piano. He had a genuine, if slightly fumbling, relationship with a fiddle that he had owned for 10 years and practiced only when he thought no one could hear. About books. About what she had thought the West would look like before she'd seen it and how it compared. About what he wanted for the ranch. About what she wanted for the Aldridge property. "You're going to need a crew," he said, "to get the house and fencing repaired before spring." "I know," she said. "Horace Webb has some names." "I can help," he said, in the careful, non-presumptuous way that she recognized as Marcus Ramsey's method of offering himself without demanding acknowledgement of what he was offering. "I know you can," she said. "I'm counting on it." They walked back to the ranch under a sky that was absolutely packed with stars, more stars than Alice had believed existed before coming west, stars that made the Philadelphia sky she'd grown up under seem like a first draft. The cold was sharp but not brutal, and she was very aware of him beside her, the warmth of his shoulder near hers, and when she stumbled slightly on a loose stone, he caught her arm and kept hold of it. And that was how they continued the rest of the way, his hand warm and steady at her elbow, both of them pretending this was purely practical. At the porch of the ranch house she stopped and turned to him, and he stopped too, and there was a moment in which the whole wide, quiet Nevada night seemed to hold its breath. He kissed her. Finally, deliberately, with all the care and seriousness that was entirely characteristic of him, and she kissed him back with everything she had been holding carefully in check for 6 weeks, and it was, she thought, exactly right. It felt like arriving somewhere after a very long journey, which was appropriate, she supposed, given everything. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers briefly, and she could feel him smiling. "Good night, Alice," he said. "Good night, Marcus," she said. She went inside. She leaned against the closed door for a moment in the dark and laughed very quietly to herself, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, as though the future was not something to be survived, but something to be genuinely, hungrily looked forward to. The following months were the best of her life. She would not have said this in the moment. She was too busy, too absorbed in the practical work of rebuilding the Aldridge property to step back and observe herself with enough distance to recognize happiness while it was happening. But looking back later, she would know it clearly. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was hard but not brutal, and she spent it working alongside Marcus and 2 of his hired hands, a taciturn Scotsman named Donnelly, and a young man of 19 named Eli, who was so eager to be useful that he occasionally became a hazard, repairing the Aldridge house, patching fences, shoring up the small barn that sat at the back of the property. She learned to use a hammer with reasonable competence. She learned the difference between good fence post placement and optimistic fence post placement. She learned, slowly and with considerable patience from Marcus, the basic principles of managing livestock, beginning with the 4 goats she purchased in January from a neighbor 2 valleys over. Marcus taught her the goats' names. The neighbor had named them after presidents, apparently as an ongoing personal joke, so she acquired Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, and helped her understand their requirements, and was present the first time she managed to milk Washington without incident, and received her triumphant announcement of this fact with an expression of pure delight that she had decided was her favorite thing in the world. They were together most days. He was on his ranch, she was on hers, but the 2 miles between them had a way of collapsing. He would ride over in the afternoon on some practical pretext, a fence question, a report from Horace Webb, a neighbor's information, and stay for supper. Or she would ride over to the Ramsey ranch in the morning and find him in the barn or the corral, and they would fall naturally into side-by-side work and conversation that was easy and deep and increasingly, honestly intimate. They talked about everything. She told him things she had not told anyone, about the loneliness of her marriage to Gerald, about the specific kind of grief she had felt at his death, which had been real but complicated by the fact that she had been grieving the marriage for much longer than she'd been grieving the man. He listened without judgment, and without the need to fix what did not need fixing, which she found so rare it occasionally made her want to weep with gratitude. He told her about the years of drifting after his father and brother, the rootlessness that he had tried to outrun by moving faster, and then had learned to outrun by stopping completely and putting his hands in the earth. He told her about the silver company, the corruption he'd witnessed there, the calculation of when to stop being silent about injustice and when to act, the price of that calculation. He had been beaten rather badly for speaking up about conditions in the mine. He showed her the scar along his ribs on an afternoon in late January when she had asked about it directly, and she had done something then that surprised them both. She reached out and placed her hand against it very gently, not with pity, but with the specific tenderness of someone who understands that a scar is not just damage, but also survival. He caught her hand against his side and covered it with his, and they stood in the golden afternoon light of the Ramsey barn, saying nothing at all for a moment that she would remember for the rest of her life. She loved him. She knew it clearly and without ambivalence by February, the way you know things that are simply and completely true. She loved his deliberate silences and his rare, complete laughter. She loved the way he treated his horses and his hired hands with the same baseline respect, as though the dignity of living things was not a matter of negotiation. She loved his honesty, which was sometimes uncomfortable and always trustworthy. She loved the way he looked at her, which was the way she imagined people looked at things they had found after a long search and intended to keep. She did not say it first, because she was, in this as in most things, someone who waited to understand what she felt completely before she spoke it. But she thought it constantly, in the particular warm hum of it that had become the background frequency of her days. He said it first. Of course he did. He said it the way he said everything important, plainly, in the exact words, looking directly at her so she could see that he meant every syllable. It was a Sunday evening in late February. They had spent the afternoon at her property, which still gave her a small private thrill every time she thought it. Working on the kitchen garden she was planning to start in April, laying out where things would go, arguing in the pleasant, equal way they argued about the best placement for tomatoes relative to the well. They had eaten supper in her kitchen, which Peters had stocked for her from the Ramsey Ranch's winter stores and which she was gradually, experimentally learning to cook in. The supper was not a triumph, but it was edible and Marcus ate it with every indication of genuine appreciation, which she suspected was a combination of honesty and kindness, in proportions she had decided not to investigate too closely. Afterward they sat on the small porch of the Aldridge house in the cold, clear night, not touching but close, looking out at the dark land and the preposterous stars. "Alice," he said. "Yes," she said. "I love you." She was quiet for a moment. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she wanted to say it right. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have for some time." "I know," he said. "I was trying to give you enough time to be certain." "You thought I was uncertain," she said, half amused, half affronted. "I thought you were careful," he said, "which is different and not a criticism." She leaned her head against his shoulder and felt his arm come around her, warm and certain. "I'm not uncertain," she said. "Not about this." "Good," he said. "Then I have something to ask you." She lifted her head to look at him. He was looking at her with an expression that was serious and warm, and held the contained nervousness of a man who is very sure of what he wants, and not at all sure of what he is going to receive. "Alice Aldridge," he said, "I have nothing to offer you that you don't already have. You have your land and your legal victory, and you have already demonstrated comprehensively that you can manage your own affairs without any assistance from me." He paused. "But I would very much like to be your husband, not because you need one, because I want to be yours." She looked at him for a long moment. The Nevada night was enormous around them, and the stars were impractical and beautiful, and the man beside her was, she knew with complete certainty, exactly what he appeared to be, honest and good, and hers if she said yes. "Yes," she said. "Of course yes." They were married on a Saturday in April of 1879, in the small white church on the edge of Carson City, with Horace Webb as witness and Dolores Vega in the front pew with tears streaming cheerfully down her face, and Eli, the young hired hand, standing at the back looking as though someone had given him a very fine gift. Peters, who had been invited under some duress, stood beside Eli and maintained his characteristic expression of gruff indifference, which everyone present understood to mean he was moved. Alice wore a dress she had ordered from San Francisco, pale blue wool, simply cut, practical enough for a woman who intended to continue working her land the Monday after the ceremony. She carried a small bunch of wild sage and desert flowers that Marcus had collected that morning himself, slightly awkwardly but with enormous care, and presented to her without explanation, as though it was simply something that needed to be done. She cried a little, saying her vows. She had not expected to, which was embarrassing, and she noted with fierce private fondness that Marcus's voice was completely steady while his left hand, holding hers, was shaking almost imperceptibly. After the ceremony there was a supper at Hattie's, their restaurant, as she would always think of it, and Dolores brought tamales, and a man with a guitar appeared from somewhere, and there was dancing on the wooden boards of the street outside as the April evening turned golden and then indigo and then full dark with stars. Marcus was not, he freely admitted, an accomplished dancer. He was a man who approached dancing the way he approached most things he had not mastered, with seriousness and total commitment, and a mild baffled frustration at his own body's resistance to the theory of the thing. She laughed at him affectionately, and he accepted this with dignity, and they found a middle speed that worked for both of them, swaying more than dancing in the warm spring night with his arms around her and her face against his neck. "Well," he said, into her hair. "Well," she agreed. They went home to the Ramsey ranch, their home now, the Aldridge property being managed and gradually improved, but the main house there not yet ready for full habitation. And the night was clear, and the stars were doing their usual extravagant thing overhead, and Alice Aldridge, who was now Alice Ramsey, and who had been a widow and a legal fighter and a candle-holder thrower and a goat owner and a kitchen gardener, and many other things she had not expected, was 26 years old and married to a man she loved with her whole heart, and the future felt like a wide, honest country stretching out in all directions. The spring of 1879 was extraordinary. The desert bloomed with a fury that Alice had been told happened in good rainfall years, and this was a good rainfall year. The sage was silver purple, and the ocotillo threw out scarlet flowers, and the creek below the Aldridge property ran clear and bright and higher than usual, and the kitchen garden she had laid out in February came in with a generosity that astonished her. Tomatoes, peppers, beans, squash, herbs. She was in it every morning before the day got hot, which was a habit she had developed and which Marcus tolerated with an equanimity she recognized as love, since it meant she rose considerably earlier than he was naturally inclined to. He had coffee waiting when she came back inside. This was their arrangement, arrived at without discussion, simply falling into place the way the best arrangements do. She gardened, he made coffee. She was reading the newspapers he had sent from Sacramento and San Francisco, keeping track of the wider world. He was managing the ranch with his characteristic steady competence, expanding the cattle operation with the careful ambition of a man who measures twice before he cuts. They talked every evening. They argued sometimes, productively, about decisions both large and small, because they were two people with strong opinions, and the respect for each other necessary to argue honestly and reach conclusions they both trusted. The Aldridge property, she still called it that even after the marriage, because it felt important to maintain its identity as hers progressed steadily through spring and summer. She hired 2 more hands, a brother and sister named Thomas and Ruth Castillo, who had been recommended by Dolores Vega, and who turned out to be exceptionally capable and good company besides. Ruth Castillo, who was 24 and possessed of opinions as definite as Alice's own, became, over the summer, something approaching a friend, the first real friend Alice had made in Nevada, and one she found she valued enormously. In August, she realized she was expecting a child. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days, not keeping it from Marcus out of secrecy, but out of the private, wondering need to let it be hers alone for a moment before it became theirs. She turned it over in her mind and her heart, the certainty of it, the enormousness of it, the way it changed and did not change the shape of her life simultaneously. She told him on a Tuesday evening after supper on the porch in the long summer twilight. She said it plainly, as she had learned from him to say important things directly and completely. He was very still for a moment. Then he got up from his chair and came to kneel in front of her and put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her with an expression she had never seen from him before, the complete and undone expression of a man whose careful containment has been overrun by something too large to manage. "Alice," he said. That was all, just her name. "Yes," she said. "I know." He pulled her forward gently and held her, and she could feel him breathing slowly and deliberately, the way he breathed when he was managing something powerful. She put her arms around him and held on. After a while he said quietly into her hair, "I am going to be a terrible worrier." "I know," she said again. "I'm going to need you to be a managed worrier." "I can try," he said. He was, to his credit, a managed worrier. He was attentive in the practical, useful way that she needed, making sure she was not overexerting, consulting with the doctor in Carson City named Dr. Alice Marsh, who was one of the very few female physicians in the Nevada territory and whose presence Alice found enormously reassuring, and quietly redistributing the physical demands of the ranch and the Aldridge property without making her feel diminished or managed. This was, she understood, a genuine feat of character, because his instinct was clearly to wrap her in cotton wool and remove all physical labor from her life entirely, and that this instinct was being disciplined rather than indulged was a specific kind of love she found very moving. She continued working, modified but present. The garden was harvested that fall with considerable satisfaction. She had preserved enough peppers and tomatoes and squash to last well into winter, and Ruth Castillo had shown her a method of pickling that she found so immediately gratifying that she pickled more or less everything within arm's reach for several weeks, to the general appreciation of everyone on both properties. The legal aftermath of the Raymond Colt matter continued to resolve through the fall of 1879. Colt was tried in October at the county seat and convicted of fraud and criminal intimidation, receiving a sentence of 7 years in the territorial prison at Elko. The 3 other families whose properties he had manipulated were awarded restitution from the proceedings against his considerable assets. Alice received a formal letter from Chester Payne of the Federal Land Office thanking her for her role in what turned out to be the exposure of a scheme that had been defrauding Nevada Territory landowners for the better part of 5 years. She read the letter to Marcus over breakfast, and he listened and then said simply, "Good," which was everything, really. Dolores Vega, who had provided the crucial notebook that had broken the case, received a formal commendation from the county sheriff's office and was also paid what turned out to be a substantial amount in back wages from the Colt estate. Her original dispute with him about unpaid wages, it emerged, had been entirely justified, and the amount owed was not trivial. She used a portion of it to expand her laundry operation and hired 2 additional women, and she and Alice developed the habit of meeting for coffee on alternating Fridays, which became one of Alice's most reliable pleasures. The baby came in March of 1880. He was born on a Thursday morning when the desert was just beginning to think about spring, in the main bedroom of the Ramsey Ranch house, with Dr. Alice Marsh in attendance and Marcus, in the next room conducting what she was told afterward was an extremely focused campaign of not pacing, which he maintained for approximately the first hour before reverting entirely. She held her son for the first time, and the world rearranged itself. He was dark-haired and pink-faced and absolutely furious about being where he was, which she felt was a reasonable response to his circumstances, and which she told him directly. He settled after a while into something more philosophical, and she looked at his face, the concentrated, unknowing seriousness of it, and felt something so large she could not have named it if she'd tried. Marcus came in when Dr. Marsh went to get him. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the two of them, and she watched something happen to his face that she knew she would carry with her always. "Come here," she said. "Come and meet him." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and she placed the baby in his arms, and Marcus Ramsey, who had spent 31 years being careful and contained, and who had held himself together through loss and hardship and drifting and uncertainty with a control that bordered on the heroic, held his son and was, for a full minute, unable to speak at all. "He's very serious," Marcus managed finally, in a voice that was not entirely steady. "He gets that from someone," Alice said. Marcus looked up at her then, and the expression on his face was so open and complete and nakedly joyful that she had to blink hard several times. They named him Daniel for no particular family reason, simply because when they said it, it fit. Daniel James Ramsey, after a discussion lasting approximately 4 minutes, which was characteristic of how they made decisions when they were both in agreement about the essential thing and merely negotiating the details. Daniel was, from his earliest weeks, a person with considerable personality. He was curious and loud and thoroughly committed to experiencing everything as immediately and completely as possible, which Marcus noted was an approach to life that seemed familiar to him, and Alice noted the same, and they both looked at the other while saying this, and neither of them clarified because they were both right. The years that followed were full and various and good. The Aldridge property, which she formalized as Aldridge Ramsey Ranch in the county records in 1881, over Marcus's mild protest that it was hers and should carry her name alone, and her counter-argument that she wanted both names on it, and the counter-argument was brief, because he recognized that argument tone and knew it indicated a decided outcome, became a working ranch in its own right by 1882, with a herd of cattle. A productive kitchen garden that had expanded into a commercial kitchen garden supplying a restaurant in Carson City and 2 households in the valley, and a reputation for producing some of the best tomato preserve in the county, a distinction that amused Alice. More than she expected, Marcus's cattle operation continued to grow, and he hired Eli, who had by now become genuinely skilled and whom Marcus trusted completely, as a full foreman. The young man took to the responsibility with the same eager competence he brought to everything, and the Ramsey Ranch was spoken of in the valley as a well-run and fair-dealing operation, which was exactly the reputation Marcus had worked toward. Donnelly, the taciturn Scotsman, departed in 1881 to pursue what he described, with characteristic brevity, as other arrangements, which turned out to involve a widow in Sacramento and a hardware store, a combination that struck everyone as deeply improbable and also entirely right for him. Peters continued to cook with the same dedicated eccentricity, now for a substantially larger household, and took to Daniel with the aggressive indifference that was his version of deep fondness, occasionally allowing the child to assist in the kitchen in ways that produced results that were alarming to consider, but not always terrible to eat. In the spring of 1882, Alice discovered she was expecting again, and this time she told Marcus the same evening, not wanting even 2 days of it to herself before it was theirs. He received the news with slightly more composure than the first time, by which she meant that he did not kneel on the floor, though he did close his eyes for a moment in the way she recognized as his version of being temporarily overwhelmed. "You are going to worry again," she said. "More productively this time," he said. "I have experience now," she laughed. He pulled her against him and held her, and Daniel, who was 2 and had the situational awareness of a small detective, appeared around the corner of the kitchen door, and announced that he wanted to know what was happening. "Something good," Alice told him. He considered this for a moment with his father's serious expression, and then said he wanted a biscuit, which was his standard response to information he was still processing. Their daughter was born in November of 1882, during the first cold snap of the season, during a brief and efficient labor that Dr. Marsh said was markedly less dramatic than the first, and Alice privately agreed that the whole experience was better when you were not terrified of the unknown component. She was pink and dark-eyed, and when Marcus held her for the first time he said, very quietly, "Hello, there," in the tone of a man greeting someone he has been expecting for some time. They named her Clara, and she was from her first weeks a person of profound tranquility, which Daniel, age 2, found both suspicious and profoundly interesting. He appointed himself her guardian and protector with a seriousness that was somewhat undermined by his still imperfect understanding of what guardianship required. But the intention was evident and moving, and Marcus noted, privately to Alice, that it was the first time in Daniel's life that Daniel had shown patience of any kind, which they both agreed was a significant development. Dolores Vega was godmother. She accepted the role with the dignified emotional response that characterized her approach to most things. That is to say, she cried immediately and then made a practical speech about godmotherly responsibilities. Horace Webb, who had retired from his law practice the previous year and was enjoying Carson City's social life with great enthusiasm, stood in the church with the expression of a man who had helped set something in motion 2 years ago and was now observing the results with considerable satisfaction. Ruth Castillo married Thomas's friend, a solidly competent man named Vicente Herrera, who worked a small cattle operation east of the valley, in 1883, and Alice and Marcus were guests of honor at the wedding, which was held at the Castillo family's property and featured food and music and dancing of a caliber that put their own wedding supper to a charming disadvantage, which Alice told Ruth directly, and Ruth received as the compliment it was intended to be. In 1884, the Aldridge Ramsey Ranch expanded again. Alice purchased an additional 60 acres to the south that became available when an older rancher named Patterson decided to sell and moved to live with his daughter in San Francisco. The purchase was made with Alice's own funds, from the proceeds of the kitchen garden operation, and from the legal restitution she had received from the Colt proceedings, and she bought it with a clarity of intention that Marcus found. He told her, deeply attractive, because it was her. It was entirely her. The same woman who had walked into Horace Webb's office with her bag in her hand and her chin up, and her claim to what was hers unassailable. They were sitting on the porch of the Aldridge Ramsey house. She had finally moved the main family residence there in 1883, finishing the renovations she'd planned since the beginning, and the house was now warm and solid and exactly right. And Marcus was telling her this, that he found her deeply attractive, and she leaned her head on his shoulder in the specific way she always had, and looked out at the land that was hers and his and theirs, and felt the wide, settled weight of a life that was genuinely good. Daniel was 4 and Clara was almost 2, and the ranch was running well, and the sky over the Nevada high desert was doing its usual magnificent, excessive thing with the stars, and the sage was silver in the moonlight, and Marcus's arm was warm around her shoulders. "Are you happy?" he asked. He asked this sometimes, not out of insecurity but out of the same genuine attentiveness he brought to everything important, wanting to know the actual answer, not the comfortable one. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "More than I knew was possible," he said. "More than I thought the world owed me." "The world didn't give you this," she said. "You made it." "We made it," he said. She considered the distinction and found it just. "Yes," she said. "We made it." The years settled into their shape with the comfortable permanence of things that have found their right form. Daniel grew into a boy of furious energy and strong opinions and surprising kindness. He had his father's directness and his mother's refusal to accept a false answer, which made him both exasperating and magnificent to know. Clara was quieter and more observant, with a dry humor that emerged gradually, and was, when it arrived, devastating in its precision, which Marcus found so recognizable in her mother that it delighted him entirely. In the summer of 1886, Alice discovered to her own astonishment that she was expecting again. She had thought honestly that her family was complete at 2 and the pregnancy was a surprise of the warmest possible kind. She told Marcus at breakfast, setting her coffee cup down and looking at him directly. He looked at her. He looked at the coffee cup. He looked back at her. "How certain are you?" he asked. "Completely," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then the smile came, the complete, unguarded one, the one that still transformed his face the way it always had. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. Their second son, William, was born in January of 1887. In the coldest January the Nevada Territory had seen in a decade, during a snowstorm that made Dr. Marsh's trip to the ranch, an adventure she later described with considerable dramatic relish at dinner parties. He was large and loud and completely healthy, and Marcus held him while Alice slept the deep, exhausted sleep of someone who has worked very hard and accomplished something substantial. And Marcus looked at his son in the snowy quiet of the Nevada winter and felt, as he had felt many times in the preceding years, but never less acutely, the precise and profound weight of a life that had turned out to be everything he had ever wanted. Daniel, who was 6, inspected his baby brother with the serious thoroughness of a senior consultant and announced that the baby seemed acceptable, which was high praise from Daniel. And Clara, who was 4, immediately named him William without anyone having discussed this, and the name stuck because, as Alice said, Clara had her father's certainty, and arguing with her father's certainty was a project with a low success rate. They had a home. They had land, hers, his, theirs. They had children who were growing into people of character. They had friends in Dolores Vega and in Ruth and Vicent and in the wider community of the valley, where the Ramsey name had become synonymous with honest dealing and fair treatment, and the kind of quiet reliability that is the most durable form of reputation. They had each other, and this, Alice thought, was the center of it. Not the land or the legal victory or the children or the successful ranches, though all of those were real and good. The center was Marcus, who had been her practical ally and her confidant and her love and her husband, who asked the real questions and listened to the real answers, who treated her always as his equal and his partner in the truest sense, who had made his cattle operation and her ranch garden and the education of their children and the management of their shared life all together, as a project they were both entirely in. In the spring of 1889, on the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Marcus arranged a supper. Not at Hattie's. Hattie's had closed in 1885 when Hattie herself retired to San Diego, but at the table they had built together in the kitchen of the Aldridge Ramsey house, with candles and a tablecloth that had been her Aunt Helena's, sent out by train as a wedding gift 9 years earlier and used only for occasions of significance. Peters cooked because he was still there, still cooking with chili powder, still gruff, and still the person whose cooking they both trusted most. Dolores brought wine. Horace Webb came from town with the slightly deaf but enormously cheerful presence he had cultivated in retirement. The children were in bed. The night was soft and the sage was blooming, and through the open window the smell of it came in, clean and sharp and entirely Nevada, entirely home. After supper, after the guests had gone, Marcus and Alice sat on the porch in the dark, and it was so like the night years ago when he had told her he loved her for the first time that she felt the echo of it like a harmonic. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he said. When Horace Webb told me about you, she said, he said you were an honest man and that in that particular situation that was rarer than silver. He was being tactful, Marcus said. He meant I was the best option available. He was right about both things, she said. So was I for listening to him. He turned to look at her in the dark. She could see his face in the faint light from the windows, older now, the lines of it more settled, the gray beginning at his temples, but those dark eyes still exactly as they had been when they first sat across from each other in a small law office and assessed each other with a directness that had felt even then like the beginning of something. "Alice," he said. "Yes," she said. "I would do it all again," he said. "Every part of it. Including the running. Including the candle holder," she said. "Especially the candle holder," he said. "I knew that night, I think, watching you throw it." "You knew what?" She said. "That you were going to change my life entirely," he said. "That I was going to spend the rest of mine being glad about it." She leaned forward and kissed him, softly, the way people kiss when they are not trying to convey urgency but simply presence. "I am here, I have been here, I will be here." When they separated, the stars were still doing their enormous, faithful thing overhead, and the Nevada wind was moving through the sage, and somewhere inside the house one of the children made a brief, dreaming sound and then was quiet again. "Come inside," she said. "It's getting cold." "In a minute," he said. "I want to look at this for another minute." So she stayed beside him, and they looked at the land together in the dark, her land, his land, their land. And the night held them in its wide, unhurried quiet, and Alice Ramsey, who had come west with 2 trunks and a legal claim and very little certainty about what she was moving toward, understood with complete clarity that she had arrived, a long time ago, exactly where she belonged. The Nevada Territory became the state of Nevada 8 years later, and by then the Ramsey children were grown into people their parents could barely take full credit for, because they had clearly done much of the work themselves. Daniel, who had gone east for 2 years of study in agriculture, and returned with ideas that he immediately began applying to the ranch operation, was practical and driven, and had his mother's chin-up quality in full measure. Clara had become a teacher in Carson City, the youngest person to hold that position in the county school, and taught with a precision and warmth that her students responded to with devotion. William, the youngest, was still finding his shape in 1897-16, and full of questions and restless intelligence, and the very particular energy of someone who has not yet found the thing they are meant to do, but is absolutely certain they will find it. Marcus turned 50 that year. Alice organized a celebration that he both resisted and secretly appreciated, with all the people who mattered gathered on the wide porch of the Aldridge Ramsey house, and Dolers brought food, and Daniel brought a bottle of whiskey from Sacramento that he considered an appropriate occasion for, and Clara gave a speech that was brief and exact and true, and William played the fiddle. He had taken to it with the ease that had eluded his father entirely, and the Nevada evening opened over all of them, warm and generous and full. Later, when everyone had gone and the house was quiet, Alice brought Marcus a cup of coffee and sat beside him on the porch in the dark. 50, she said. "It would appear so," he said. "How does it feel?" she asked. He thought about this in the genuine way he considered things, not reaching for the comfortable answer. "Like I got here," he said. "Like I'm somewhere I was always trying to reach, and I got here and it's better than I thought." She put her hand over his. The same hand she had held in the dark street behind the saloon, the same hand that had held hers all the way through. "You were always going to get here," she said. "You just needed the right direction." "You were pointing it," he said. "Whether you knew it or not," she laughed quietly in the warm Nevada night. "We were both pointing it," she said, "whether we knew it or not." He turned his hand over and held hers properly, firmly, the way he had always held things he intended to keep. The stars came out over the Nevada high desert, as they always had and always would, enormous, truthful, indifferent to everything except their own light. And Marcus and Alice Ramsey sat together in the dark on the porch of the ranch they had built and watched them for a long time, saying very little, because very little needed to be said. The land was theirs. The life was theirs. The love between them was as real and solid and enduring as the high desert rock, shaped by weather and time into something that could not be doubted or dismantled or taken away by any force that the wide, wild West had yet managed to produce. And that, Alice thought, pressing her shoulder against his in the dark, was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.